It's the Jonkel Podcast number 18, and today I want to swing things back around to a topic that I've covered before, but I want to sort of summarize and bring together maybe different elements of what has already been brought up. And I was thinking a title might be something like the Jewish Internet. And the concept here being that when we look at the Jewish people, when we look at their history, there's two ways we can view it. We can view it as, as the Enlightenment thinkers did, where they picked apart the Torah, and people like Edward Gibbon would say, well, the Jews would write one thing, but actually it would be the opposite. So they would do a kind of inversion or subversion of the Torah. And we could analyze that perspective. But today, what I want to focus on is, the Torah, taking it sort of at its word, and describing the psychological process that is documented in the Torah, whether that's real or fictional, whether it's mythological, metaphorical, allegory, whatever. What is going on here, and how does that relate to the present day? So when we have the Jewish people, the first thing we know about them is they come from, or Abraham comes from, somewhere in Babylonia, somewhere in Tigris, Euphrates. And he's driven by some force, positive or negative. He's driven into the land of Canaan. He and his descendants don't stay there for long. I believe it's his son Isaac who goes back to his father's homeland. I think he goes to visit one of the relatives, maybe an uncle or something. And he undergoes some tests or challenge. He finds his wife, and then I believe at that point he goes back to Canaan. Then he has his descendants, Jacob, who becomes Israel. And Jacob, who becomes Israel, is alienated from his family. He's cast out, he's cast away. He has to flee Esau because of the deception that he pulls over Esau's eyes. He gets one over on Esau. So when we look at this situation, then we have to understand this in sort of the context of a culture of deception versus a culture of truth. When we look at Indo-European or just European warfare, and we look at the concept of honesty in battle. So a basic individual battle would be something like a duel. Two people have swords or two people have guns, and it's supposed to be fair. You're not supposed to trick your way out of it. You're just supposed to, if it's a duel with swords, you duel with swords. If it's a duel with firearms, you take your 10 steps, you turn around, you fire, and that's it. There's no Sun Tzu trickiness. There's no deception. There's no art of war to it. It's simply whoever's the better shot at that particular time. And things are sort of left up to fate. And you can think of a lot of military formations in European history as taking this mentality of directness and fairness, that two lines of soldiers, they square up with one another, they fire their weapons until, everyone's dead on the other side or they run away or something. So there's a concept of being fair, facing your enemy, not backstabbing. Who's the worst guy in Norse mythology? Who is it that sides with the giants? It's Loki, the deceiver, the trickster. So among the gods, Loki is sort of the Judas figure. And we could then move into Christianity and say, who's the worst guy among the disciples? It's Judas who betrays Christ. So the betrayal, the deceiver, the one who pretends to be loyal but is not loyal. That's a huge theme in Christianity, in Norse mythology. If we look over at Japan, which has a similar demographic situation where you have a bunch of different shogunates, but everyone's pretty much genetically homogeneous, very similar to Europe, and the concept of the samurai, the highest honor being loyalty, that if you're to bring dishonor to your lord in Japan, you have to commit seppuku, you have to kill yourself. So this insistence on loyalty and this distaste of, lying and deceit, this search for the truth, it's indicative to me of a situation in which you're surrounded by people like yourself. If I had a clone or a twin or something like that, I could trust that person because I would know how they work. I would know how they think. They would think like me. I would intuitively understand before even communicating with them. I would already understand what they're likely to do, what they're likely not to do. And we would have a shared interest. We would have a genetic interest in common, going to Richard Dawkins, his theory of the selfish gene. We would have an incentive to put aside our own individual interests and work toward a collective interest. So whenever we are surrounded by people like ourselves, we have an incentive to be altruistic. We have an incentive, according to Richard Dawkins and his theory of the selfish gene, we have an incentive to act collectively. And that means putting the truth over our own individual interests, because seeking the truth benefits the group as a whole, or being loyal benefits the group as a whole. And even if that leads to something extreme like suicide, that's still seen as, or in the final analysis, the selfish gene analysis, it's still beneficial for the genes themselves if we act altruistically, if we seek the truth above our own interests, if we're loyal above our own interests. But if you're in a situation where you're in a hostile midst, you're within tribes that are within other tribes, and you're alienated and you feel opposed by the majority, then all of what I just said flips on its head. And you have a situation where already Abraham, by leaving his homeland, going to a new land, he's already putting himself in that situation. He's already setting himself up for a situation in which truth and loyalty become liabilities, and what really becomes important is deceitful self-interest and a trickster mentality. And that is why in that situation for Abraham's, it's Isaac's son, I believe, Isaac's son being Jacob or Israel, the highest good, the moral good that he can do in that situation is to deceive his brother who is not like him. His brother is opposite from him. His brother is hairy. His brother is hirsute. His brother, there's physical differences between them. There's mental differences between them. In fact, some people look at this story and they say this is the Paleolithic man versus the Neolithic man. I think that's a great analogy. You have a man who is honest in his dealings versus a man who's dishonest. A man of hunting and gathering versus the man of the city, the urban man, the Neolithic man, the man who tricks the animals into the pen and feeds them only to kill them. So the contrast there is clear, and this continues and reinforces itself as we go on. So we go on from the story of Israel, then he has his sons, and eventually they make their way to Egypt. And again, it's the Jews in Egypt, which are at this point a very limited group, a very small number of people in the narrative. You have even just an individual who rises to the top in this Egyptian society. He's not of Egyptian society. It's not in his interest to, uplift the Egyptians and bring good things to the Egyptians, but he occupies a high status in Egypt, and he gains power within the Egyptian system so that he can really benefit his brothers, his kinsmen, who then return to him. Many colored coats. I think it begins with a J. The Joseph. Joseph is the next one we're talking about. So Joseph is an alien among his other brothers. Joseph is cast out of the family. He's sort of cast out of one alienating situation into another alienating situation in which he's the lone Jew among the Egyptians. So again, we see this reinforced from Abraham to Isaac, down through Jacob, who becomes Israel, and then through Joseph. There's sort of a eugenic process here, where we can imagine that Abraham is from some Semitic tribe living in Babylonia, and he breaks away to start his own thing. And then from Abraham, we get Isaac, who then breaks away from his father to go do his own thing. And he comes up with a deceptive process to hoodwink his uncle or whatever relative he's visiting, to win I believe it's his cousin or niece or some relative in marriage. He has a goal, he has an objective, and he uses his smarts to outwit his... Again, he's going against his family. He's splitting off from his family to get what he wants to achieve his own self-interest. Then the move back to Canaan. Then Joseph coming to the fore, and Joseph saying, I'm going to break away from my own family. I'm going to go off on my own, going to go among the Egyptians. But ultimately, I'm not doing it for the sake of... I'm not going to Egypt because I love Egypt so much. I'm going to Egypt so that I can control Egypt, so that I can use Egypt, so that Egypt can become my tool. He doesn't view himself as part of Egypt. He views himself as the ruler, the Lord, the master of Egypt. Even though he is not the Pharaoh, he's not the top. He is the top advisor to the Pharaoh. And so rather than being the figurehead, rather than being the front man, rather than being the representative of Egypt, he is the one who controls the representative. So this continues on and on after Joseph, and we can look throughout Jewish history where they finally make it to the Promised Land. But even before that, we should also mention Moses, right? Because Moses is someone who he's sort of cast out. Literally, he's cast out from the Jewish community from birth. His mother puts him in a basket, puts him in the river. So in a sense, he's physically shoved off into the river away from the Jewish community. So he has no connection to his Jewish roots. He's totally deracinated. And very much like Joseph, he becomes an important figure, an important authority in Egyptian society. And somehow the blood awakens in him, and he sees this Egyptian abusing a Jew, and somehow he goes into Hulk mode or whatever his ancestral voices are calling him, and he kills the Egyptian. So, again, we have someone totally divorced from his people, totally deracinated, tries to assimilate into another people, but he can never truly assimilate. He can never truly become Egyptian. His blood is always calling him. And so he has to kill the Egyptian. He's compelled to kill the Egyptian. And he sort of rejoins the Jewish community now at its head. So what does that tell us? That the head of the Jews is the least Jewish Jew of all. Right? The most Egyptian Jew, the Jew who is best at assimilating into the Egyptian society, should become the head of the Jewish society. He should become the master of all Jews. He should become the patriarch who is closest to God, which is an incredible, again, this incredible inversion where the person who is least like the other Jews is deemed to be sort of the king of the Jews, or the leader of the Jews. And it's also true that Moses marries an Ethiopian, or he takes an Ethiopian wife, and the other Jews castigate him for this. They say, well, you're violating our laws. You're violating our conception of our identity by marrying this Ethiopian woman. But that's who Moses is. He is a taboo breaker. He is someone who is the least Jewish Jew, and yet he's the king of the Jews. So that kind of inversion is a staple of Judaism. Eventually they do get to Israel down the line. They get back to Canaan. They make it Israel. And what then happens? Well, after some good years and some bad years, and we could even go into David versus Goliath, the inversion that happens there. The weaker man wins, or the weaker boy wins against the man. The height differential that happens there, the defeat of the warrior by the intellectual, by the smarter man, by the more clever man, by the more deceitful man, the more skillful man wins. We could look at the conflict then between David and Saul, where Saul is sort of the rightful king, and David usurps that. We could talk about, but I really want to skip to kind of more, not modern history, but the periods in which the Jews are in captivity, not just by Egyptians now, but they're in captivity by Persians. And they go to Persia, and what again happens? Well, people like Esther, and I think Mordecai is another one, who become big advisors to the leaders in Persia. And a man stands up, Haman. Haman is a majoritarian. Haman wants an ethnically homogeneous Persia. Haman is disturbed by the presence of this foreign ethnic group, which is disproportionately powerful in Persia. And so Haman according to the Torah, embarks on a plan of genocide. This is thwarted, and Haman and all his followers are killed. You know, it sounds exactly, I mean, he sounds like a Nazi. If this wasn't written before, 1933 or even the 20th century at all, I would think that, man, the Jews really retrofitted the Bible with a lot of Nazi references here, right? But as it turns out, the Nazis weren't the first to do what they did. They were really just continuing the ancient Indo-Persian tradition of having this reaction, this xenophobic reaction to Jewish power and Jewish dominance. So yeah, they have a problem in Persia, and they solve that by gaining minoritarian power within Persia. Eventually, they make their way back to Israel. After having been in the Babylonian captivity. Now, at this point, the Greeks come in with their Hellenistic dominance, and they start building temples to Zeus and statues to Zeus. And they're opposed by the Maccabees. They're opposed by warriors. But this doesn't stop with the Greeks. It continues with the Romans. The Romans do the same thing. They come in, they wreck the temple, they defile the temple, they put statues of Zeus inside the Jewish temple. And this is a critical period for me because, I mean, it's all reflections on the same thing. Like, each story that I'm telling here, each little narrative is the same thing over and over again. But it's really important to me here where the Jewish people are sort of stuck between two worlds. On the one hand, the Jewish people have always been cosmopolitan. On the other hand, they've always been invested in their soil, in the land of Israel. And when the Romans come and they defile the temple in this way, what they do is they destroy the locus of Jerusalem as a physical place. And Jerusalem transforms into this abstract ideal. And so Jerusalem is no longer a physical place that people then make pilgrimage to and that they then visit for spiritual power, but Jerusalem is an idea that we can access through abstract thought. That, to me, is a very important shift in the history of Judaism, even though it's technically not anything new. This sort of thing has happened before, but it's important because rather than having a Middle Eastern Judaism, a Judaism where, Jerusalem is the center of the Jewish world, the destruction of the temple, in a sense, frees up the Jewish people to become totally cosmopolitan, to totally abandon any sense of physical locus, and to then become, their locus is now telos. Their locus is now the world of abstract ideas, the world of the Talmud. And that's really when Talmudism takes off. The Jews no longer feel tied to their Bible because the Bible is sort of outdated, it's outmoded, or the Torah makes reference to all these physical places, physical battles that were, of course, important if you were living in that area. That made those spaces sacred to you, that made those spaces holy. But once you have the destruction of the temple, I believe it's the second destruction of the temple, when you have that, then the problem is that the Jews, they don't choose to rebuild physically, but they choose to rebuild themselves mentally. And so Judaism no longer becomes about any specific piece of land, any magic dirt. Judaism becomes an idea. Judaism becomes, what is the destination of the Jews? Well, it's Jerusalem. But what is Jerusalem? Jerusalem is an idea. It's a concept. It's a concept where each Jew will be a priest and each non-Jew will tug at the hem of each Jew asking for guidance and wisdom. That's the idea. So the Jews make their way all around the Mediterranean, up into northern Europe. Now, again, there are revisionist views on Khazaria and the Jews. Oh, are they really Hebrews or are they Turks or, whatever's going on. I'm not even interested in this moment at that. We could go into that and we could analyze the DNA and see are they more related to ancient Semites? Are they more related to this Turkish Khazarian tribe? We could do that. That's not even what I'm interested in. I'm actually more interested in the mythology of Judaism and than in the actual history, because if you look at the mythology, it paints a narrative that gives you a worldview, that gives you a telos, that instructs you on how to act and how to think and how to choose a partner and how to raise your children and how to create a culture. So to me, the myth is actually somewhat more important than the history itself. So when we talk about Khazaria, for example, I would look at it within this current thread that I'm stringing here. I would look at it as, the Jews were attracted to Khazaria because Khazaria was a stop along one of the Silk Road routes. There's another one through the Middle East, but you can also go from Asia through Central Asia up into Khazaria into Europe. And that's why they were so prominent there. That's why they were attracted to it, because it was this trade empire, essentially. And that's why they were so interested in it. So, the various things happen throughout history. And ultimately, the Jews go through many tumultuous years in Europe. And they survive, and they thrive, and they see opportunities in Islam. So Moorish Spain, when the Muslims take over Spain, the Jews have a golden age. They have a lot of authority. They have a lot of clout. They are able to wiggle their way into high positions in Islamic society. And they see that as very beneficial. There's a story, I believe, about the Battle of Vienna or somewhere in the Byzantine Empire or in the Balkan area that Jews were aiding the Ottomans in their invasion of that region because they saw Islam as more beneficial than Christianity. Christianity sort of kept a tighter lock on their power and limited them more than Islam seemed to. So they see various opportunities for themselves. They have various setbacks. And eventually we come to times of Frankism and Spinoza. Frankist ideas are essentially this, again, a supreme inversion. So taking everything that the Torah says and just turning it on its head and saying that, well, the Torah says you should be monogamous, or the Torah says that you should be afraid of sex, or you should be a Puritan. And so we're going to turn that on our head, and we'll have these Frankist Sabbatean orgies. This is something happening in Poland, and the guy eventually converted to Islam, which is, it is what it is. But you have that sort of supreme inversion. You also have Spinoza, who is talking about, we need to abandon the physicality of Judaism, and we need to become extremely abstract, extremely universal. And one can view Spinoza, certainly from an Orthodox position, one can view Spinoza or Jacob Frank as being anti-Jewish or subverting Judaism. But again, starting with Abraham and all the patriarchs up until that point, I see really they're tapping into the ancient fundamental essence of Judaism, which is that inversion, that subversion of expectations, breaking away from the family, breaking away from the tribe, only to come back and lead the tribe. So those concepts to me are very important here. Eventually, though, we do have Jewish emancipation in Europe, spearheaded by people like Napoleon as a consequence of the French Revolution. And the concept there is that the Jews should just assimilate into Europe. But rather than that happening necessarily, there's a split in the Jewish community between different factions of Orthodox, so the Hasidim and various other, random Jewish factions. You have then the Reform Jews who talk about assimilation. They talk about casting away the burden of tradition and going into something new. But, in a sense, I see the Reform Jews as more authentically Jewish than the Orthodox Jews. Because, again, to me, the essence of Judaism is casting away that which is old and embracing that which is new. Abandoning your family, abandoning your tribe, abandoning your homeland, exploring some new territory, breaking some new taboo. And so the way that Reform Judaism expresses itself and then manifests as atheist Judaism and communist Judaism and all these different sects and different branches, that explosion of creativity is something that's really important. And when I look at the present day, so we've sort of brought ourselves up to the present day here by going through this history. And the way I see it is the same forces, and some of them could be active, some of them could be passive forces, but the same forces that made the Jews who they are now universalizing in what we call globalism, and it's impacting everyone. And this whole trend, I place the Jews and the essence of Judaism within the context of the broader Neolithic, that the last 10,000 years, ever since the transition from Paleolithic to Neolithic, that is a fundamental change in the way of thinking. That is a revolution in the way of human thinking. And the Jews are sort of a concentrated emanation or an example of this broader 10,000-year-long trend. And that concentrated essence of Judaism is now expanding and universalizing and spreading to everyone on the planet. So we can look at this through various things. We could look at the transgender phenomenon as the breaking away from gender norms, breaking away from the family, breaking away from tribes, and becoming your own person, becoming extremely separate. The concept of, there's different forms of individualism. There's the individual who is the hero, who fights the dragon for the sake of his kin. Siegfried goes out and he fights monsters to save his people. But then there's the individualism that breaks away from the tribe in order to become their own person, to then, work their way up through a foreign system all the way to the top, and then, do another turnaround where, you've reached the top of Egyptian society. Do you feel like an Egyptian? No, and then you start killing Egyptians, and then you start declaring Jewish holy war or whatever. So, you see this reflected, you see this essence, you see this spirit reflected in people. And I guess the question for me is, are you just going to be reactionary about it? Are you going to look at this force and you're going to say, well, this is terrible? And this is sort of what Ted Kaczynski did, which is why, I reference him not because I think he was stupid. I reference Ted Kaczynski because I think he understood the essence of things. Now, his reaction was just to say, let's go back to the Paleolithic. Essentially, let's destroy industrial society. We don't need farming. We just need to go back living in the woods, hunting, trapping, gathering. That's the natural way to be. That's the psychologically healthy way to be. I think he had a point there in that ultimately, who are we as human beings? We are not entirely divorced from our ancestral origins. And our genetics is composed for an environment that is very, very ancient, very, very old. Our genetics hasn't changed as much as we might have liked to have seen it change in the last 10,000 years. And a lot of the adaptations we've made, for instance, in intelligence, as we've gained in intelligence, we've gained in adaptability, we've made gains in our ability to think abstractly and to, be computer programmers or something like that. As we've made those kinds of gains, we've also had to sacrifice certain things. And so neurosis and anxiety and depression and antisocial personality and sociopathy and the ugliness of the face. So as we make certain gains that allow us to become more adapted to our evolving environment, at the same time we sacrifice things that make us human. We sacrifice things that make us happy. We sacrifice things that make us whole, and we become more robotic, and we become more self-interested. And this trend, it's not without its consequences. It's not without its drawbacks. It's not without increasing rates of suicide. It's not without significant problems of drug addiction and video game addiction, entertainment addiction, escapism. There are all kinds of problems that come along with this, and Ted Kaczynski realized that, and he was honest about it. Most people aren't honest about it, because I think if people were honest about it, a lot more people would agree with someone like Ted. But they're not honest about it. Now, I look at Ted and I hear what he's saying, and I hear his pain. But I look at history and I say, we've been doing this for 10,000 years, and on a greater scale, if you look at evolution as a whole, the transition from a dinosaur-dominated Earth to a mammal-dominated Earth, or at least insofar as large land animals are concerned, if we look at that, then this trend, this evolutionary trend, I'm sure it was terrible for the dinosaurs to go extinct. I'm sure there was a lot of pain and suffering felt by the dinosaurs. But can you stop the clock? Can you turn back the clock? Is that even possible? I'm not sure that it is. To me, it seems that things move forward, things move onward, and those which adapt, those which don't die. And given those facts, as painful as this process is, as much ugliness as might be involved, it's still something that is forcing its way through. There's larger context here, and as we hone in on smaller cultural moments, the transgender thing is like, the popularity of it is very short-lived. Just 20 years ago, we were having Bill Clinton talk about don't ask, don't tell. That was considered the liberal position. Don't ask, don't tell. Now it's if you don't ask someone's pronouns before addressing them, now you can be fired. That sort of thing, right? So the shift in culture, we see this little microcosms of 10,000 year and even million year developments. So in that sense, I'm questioning, can you oppose this little microcosmic event if it's really just part and parcel of a larger development, a million-year development? I think it's time to swing back around to the perspective title, the Jewish Internet. We could view the Internet in a Faustian way. We could view it as giving people freedom, much like the ancient Eurasian steppe. That, though, is decreasing, and we could even say that there is something Faustian in Judaism itself. There's a universalism to Judaism, that there's a global concept in Judaism. So that's not even necessarily a contradiction. But let's at least look at it through this specific narrative lens. The internet is an urban environment. It's a people-dense environment. It's an environment of disparate outlooks, disparate point of views, difference, uniqueness. So the internet is a place where you can encounter all sorts of things that are opposed to you, that are different from you, that are alien to you, that are new to you. And much of what drives the internet is this sense of newness. And that, to me, is one of the essences of Judaism, this sense of newness, this sense of going into an undiscovered territory, this sense of, going beyond the home, going beyond the tribe, going beyond that which is familiar, going beyond the soil, transporting yourself to another world. So that, to me, there's a deep connection between this obsession with newness, this obsession with breaking down taboos, this obsession with, our comedian culture, where we take something that we hold as sacred, or we take something that we hold as mundane, and we flip it on its head. That's a large part of comedy. That's why Jews are so successful in comedy, is because it's so intuitive to them that you should take something, you should flip it on its head, or you should take something sacred and you should defile it, or you should take something that's normally defiled and you should hold it up as sacred. So this inversion, this flipping, this turning things on its head, the sense of newness, looking at, first you had jeans, and then what was the purpose of jeans? Jeans were originally working class pants. And so then they said, well, all the rich people are going to start wearing jeans and make it a fashion symbol. And then what happened next? Well, then they had ripped jeans. They said, well, it's not enough to have the jeans, the pants of the working class for the rich. We now need to rip them and make them look beat up and dirty. And now you've got it to the point where, we have yoga pants, and now you have like ripped yoga pants, or like very complex designs, and this sense of newness when we look at fashion. Of course, fashion, especially in Europe, has been this constantly evolving thing. But the pace of fashion today does surprise me, the pace at which things change, the pace at which we come to despise that which is old, or that which is so last year. That's so 2018. We're in 2019. It's the current year. There's this total disregard for tradition. There's this total disregard for that which came before us. And, that is what the internet is all about, right? The internet's all about something new, something you've never seen before, something exciting. And if you have, and I'm one of these people who rarely do I read a book twice, rarely do I watch a movie twice. I'm not saying it hasn't happened. But there is this kind of concept where you can't experience the same thing twice. You have to keep pushing to something new. You have to keep, that's why current events are so important. It's why if you want to have a successful podcast, you have to keep referencing current events, new events. You can't just talk about eternal ideas. You can't just talk about old things because that's boring. That's stupid. That's worthless. You have to keep up with the times. You have to be ahead of the curve. You have to be on the vanguard. So, yeah, those concepts, those revolutionary concepts, the revolutionary nature of the internet to always subvert your expectations, to push something new, well, isn't that very in line with the original spirit of Judaism going from Abraham to Reform Judaism, that whole tradition? That, and some people might call it an anti-tradition. That the essence of Judaism are actually the core motivating spirit, not the way that it ossifies itself in Orthodox Judaism, because Orthodox Judaism is just this ossification process or a dogmatic form of Judaism where you take precepts and laws and you follow them to the letter, and again, it's an ossification, it's a codification. But we see that pipeline. We see how the children of Orthodox Jews very quickly become communists, or they become Reform Jews, or they become atheists, or whatever. We see that potential is there within that ossified form. It's almost like a frozen form of Judaism can then thaw very quickly within a generation and spring into the newness of, you can look at anyone like, famous Jewish porn stars like Ron Jeremy. What's his family history? And very, I can't remember all the Jewish porn star names right now. But you can look back in their family history and find very conservative values, very conservative outlooks on sexuality, and how that very quickly changes, how that very quickly inverts and shifts itself around. That's very much in consonance with the spirit of the internet, the way that the internet functions. And it's interesting because a lot of times when we think about the internet, we think about the importance of connectivity. To me, the connectivity is not even the key element here, or the new element of the internet. The importance of the internet is the computer. That in the 1940s in Germany, Konrad Zuse invented this computing machine. And it was then, that technology then made its way to America, and we already had forms of connectivity. We already had the telegram. We already had the telephone. So merely connecting different computers, you create a computer network. And the importance of the internet is with the computing power, the ability to generate text quickly, and then to generate images quickly, and then videos quickly. That it's all connected. It's all an expansion upward in that way. The ability to shift things quickly, right? That was what the printing press did for Martin Luther. So we look at Thierry Baudet's speech in the Netherlands. He won 13 out of 75 seats. And they're now the biggest party in the Senate. So we can look at this microcosm, this microcosmic victory of populism. You can read about Thierry Baudet. He's talked with Jared Taylor. He's not necessarily a white nationalist. He's part Indonesian. He's not of pure ancestry or anything, but he talks about boreal nations, which is really just a prefix away from Hyperborean nations. And I mean, he's using some pretty, he's talking about rapists and robbers. He says, we saw rapists, robbers, and other scum roam our streets freely. It's a disgrace. And so he is putting some extreme stuff out there, some new stuff out there. And, that's interesting. But my question is, how is Thierry Baudet and his Forum for Démocratie, how is that going to address what I see as the outer layers of the onion? See, when we're in this moment, we're in this little microcosm of history, this year or the last, post-Trump age, the last 5 years or something. When we're living in this little microcosm and we're focusing on, okay, how can we make this marginal victory? How can we gain some political seats here? How can we gain some numbers on our website here? Or something like that. We're focused in on these little trends of moving the Overton window slightly this way and that way. But then we zoom out, we look at the layers of the onion of history, and we're seeing that it's not just about the migration crisis. It's not even just about the internet culture. It's not even just about Judaism. And it's not even just about the Neolithic. But it's about the story of evolution as a multi-million-year-long history of, you have a species, you have a way of living, you have a way of being. And through some forces, some environmental change, some butterfly effect or some domino effect, that you have a feedback loop that pushes species toward a different development that causes the extinction of some, the genocide of some, the killing of a kind, and the birth of a new kind. And we see that in Ragnarok. We see how the gods that were so powerful and so honored and revered, how they die, and what's left is a green shoot out of the ground, and 2 humans miraculously appear and they repopulate the earth. We don't know what happens yet next, but there is this concept that things come to an end and things then come to a new beginning. And the question is, this kind of national populism, is that the new beginning? Is that something that is that the trajectory that we are going in as a species? Or is this sort of like the last roar of the dinosaurs? Is this a dying ideology? Is this a dying way of living that is, in its death throes, and to the microcosmic, the myopic observer, they're looking at these death throes and thinking of it as a battle charge and a new beginning. But in reality, it's actually the end of this way of thinking. That way of thinking being that, being tied to a particular place, a particular locus, being tied to the homeland, being tied to all of these things that you see. The Jewish people at one point were tied to their land of Israel. But because of the opposition that they faced this opposition from the Greeks and the Romans, and they came to a point where they couldn't look backwards anymore. They couldn't have, they did have some nostalgia, but they couldn't reclaim their sovereignty. They lost the sovereignty of their nation state. They lost sovereignty within their ethnic homeland, or the one that they claimed. And they had to ascend beyond that, and they had to ascend into a world of abstraction, and they had to go beyond the physical locus of Jerusalem, and they had to then sublimate and revolutionize the concept of Jerusalem. That Jerusalem isn't a physical place, but it's a way of thinking. It's a way of being. It is the essence of Judaism. It's this abstract idea. So that concept that Jews had, because they were confronted by this extreme challenge, basically foreigners were flooding into their lands, and they couldn't resist them. They couldn't overcome them. They tried with the Maccabees, but they couldn't win the Roman-Jewish wars. They were defeated. And so what happened is that instead of killing themselves, instead of disappearing, instead of assimilating, they took those concepts of homeland, they took the concept of tradition, they took the concept of Jerusalem, and they spiritualized those concepts. Now, if you're familiar with Christianity, you know that Christianity then did this again. It took the Jewish people and it said, the Jewish people are no longer a people of physical ancestry. They're a people of spiritual ancestry. And so what the New Testament does is it says it doesn't matter if you're descended physically from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What matters is, are you spiritually descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? And so in that way, Christianity is a really interesting thing. It's a really interesting thing in that it takes a lot of these core principles of Judaism and it tries to spiritualize them in not necessarily in the same way, but it spiritualizes them at the same time that Jews themselves are spiritualizing Judaism into something else, into Talmudical Judaism. These are different approaches to Judaism. One says we're going to spiritualize Judaism by making it a non-ethnic category, by making it a religious category, a trans-ethnic category, a transnational category. And then Talmudic Judaism says, no, we're going to keep our ethnic component. We're going to maintain the concept of physical descent, but we're going to internationalize. We're going to leave the locus of Jerusalem. And now the center of the Jewish world is in Spain, and now it's in Ukraine, and now it's in Poland, and now it's in Germany, and now it's in France, and now it's in England. And it's wherever we want it to be because it's an abstract concept. It's not dedicated or it's not anchored to any physical space. So those were two. In a sense, Christianity is a more extreme version of Judaism than Judaism itself. People can be angry that I'm saying that or react badly, but if you understand what I'm saying here, that there's this essence of Judaism which is always escaping the physical and going toward the abstract, then you can understand what I'm saying. Now, of course, I didn't even bring this up earlier, but a great way to illustrate that is the fact that the Jewish God has no idols. The Jewish God cannot be represented. The Jewish God has no face. Most ancient peoples conceived of their gods as having a face. Sometimes the Egyptians said they have a face of an animal. The Anubis has a face of a fox, I believe, or a jackal. So, Horus has the face of a hawk or of a bird. It might even be a desert eagle. So these different gods have different faces. The Greeks and Romans looked at the faces of the gods. They said, oh, this god has blonde hair, this god has blue eyes, this god has red hair, this god has green eyes. So they would describe the various gods physically. They said there's a physical manifestation that represents the god. Judaism said, no, we divorce ourselves from that physical representation. And we want to dedicate ourselves to that which is abstract. We want to totally eliminate our dedication to the physical representation because physicality is something that can be destroyed. All beauty eventually fades. No matter how beautiful a woman is, no matter how handsome a man is, eventually they're going to get old and die and turn into bones and dust. That's ephemeral. That's not something you can invest your faith in. If all you care about is, bodybuilding and getting that perfect physique, well, maybe you can have that for 10 or 20 or 30 or even 40 years, but eventually there's going to come a point in which your physique is destroyed, your physique passes away, and you die and there's nothing left. And so Judaism said, let's not invest our hope and our faith in things of the physical world because all things in the physical world are destroyed. Our temple is destroyed, our homeland is destroyed, our people are destroyed, we're destroyed in battle, everything physical we can't resist physically. There's no physical option here. So we have to abstract, we have to spiritualize, we have to eliminate idols. We have to conceive of a religion, a path in which we're not invested in the physical world, but we're invested in a spiritual world. We're invested in a world of abstraction. Even so far as betraying the Torah and lifting up the Talmud, or betraying the Torah and lifting up Frankism, or betraying the Torah, lifting up Spinoza, betraying the Torah, lifting up Marx, and so on and so forth. This idea is an evolutionary idea. It's an adaptive idea, and that's why it's successful. So the question to me is, obviously we understand that there are huge consequences to abandoning your homeland. It's a very painful thing. But I have to wonder if these short-lived victories, when Marine Le Pen has a short-lived victory, when there's a short-lived victory in the Netherlands, when the Alternative for Deutschland has a short-lived victory in Germany, when Brexit has a short-lived victory in the United Kingdom, when Trump has a short-lived victory in America, you get energized, you get excited, you get caught up in the moment and think, hey, maybe we could go back to a time of homelands. Maybe we could go back to a time where the family was intact. Maybe we could go back to a time of normativity and normalcy where our expectations were not constantly subverted, that we had a real tradition. Maybe we could go back to that because that's what's normal and natural and healthy and what feels good to us psychologically. So there's always that hope, but continually I see that hope being dashed. I see that hope being given and then pulled away. I see that hope being thrown out there as a bread in a circus to appease people. Trump is a clown, and he's put out there to make his Trump circus and to get everyone involved. And then as you pull back the curtain, you see that, and you take off the clown makeup, you see him for who he really is, as a pathetic man who's controlled by greater forces. He doesn't have any agency of his own. He's not working for our collective good. He's working for his self-interest, if anything. You see that. No, I'm not saying don't vote for Trump. He's better than the opposition. But still taking a cynical position here and looking at him in that way, you see then these investing our hopes in nationalism and populism often only serves to demoralize us and to depress us and to blackpill us. And the question is, how far must we go down this path before we hit some wall, much like the Jewish people hit a wall, where Abraham hit a wall in his homeland, where Isaac hit a wall against, and I might even be doing it wrong here. Right, so if I said that Isaac was the brother of Esau, that was wrong. Brother of Jacob. Anyway, so Isaac hits a wall in Canaan. He has to go back to the homeland, and then he has to go back, and then he has two sons, and Jacob hits a wall with Esau, and Joseph hits a wall with his brothers. Moses hits a wall with the Egyptians. There's some point at which they realize, hey, we've got to break away, we've got to leave, we've got to escape. We can't tie ourselves to this sinking ship. We can't tie ourselves to that which is obviously appealing, is obviously feels good and feels natural, feels right to us. But at what point are we going to abandon those things which are not evolutionary, those things which are not adaptive? And at what point are we going to embrace minoritarian strategies that are adaptive, that are evolutionary, that are successful? I could be wrong. It could be the case that minoritarianism is going to win. And it is sort of a perennial question of the balance of opposites. If you have a good thing, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So if nationalism really works for Europe, and this national populism really works, and perhaps the last 60, 70 years have just been an accident of history, perhaps it's just been a period of oopsies, sorry, we opened the can of worms, we destroyed marriage, we created multiracialism, we did all kinds of strange things, and that was just a big accident. That was all just some random freak incident that got sort of out of hand, and so instead we're going to go back to the way things should be. I guess what I would say here is that if we look at the Jewish people, they are not an entirely revolutionary people. They do have Zionists who are blood and soil type ethno-nationalists. You do have the Orthodox who are traditionalists, who are conservative, who vote for Trump, who are against breaking the law of the Torah and whatever. So Judaism itself and the Jewish people are not one-sided or one-minded. It's not that they're completely cosmopolitan. They have no nationalist element to them. But they have both sides. They have two strategies, and ultimately they complement each other and try to work together and try to approach the problem of Jewish well-being from different perspectives. And I would tell that to anyone. I would say, look, if you want to be successful, you can't put all your eggs in one basket. That's not an anti-fragile strategy. You may think you have the perfect strategy. Of course, I have my conception of what the future will be like, but you have your own projection. And one of us is right and one of us is wrong. But we can't tell with 100% certainty who's who. Am I correct to say that nationalism is a big facade, that it's a big circus, and that ultimately things are going to continue as they have been continuing for a very long time, and we're going to be in a situation in which the internet is closing it's decreasing the importance of physical space. It's decreasing the importance of what's your homeland. And so when someone asks me, why do you care about what's going on in Europe? I would say, well, why wouldn't I care? I'm a global citizen. I'm a citizen of the world. I care about what happens everywhere. And so I care about, whether the world is improving or it's getting worse. I'm not a nationalist. I'm not an American particularist. I don't just care about what goes on in America. So time will tell which approach is better, the more particularist or the more universalist or what have you. But I think at the very least people should entertain the idea of tolerance toward different viewpoints. And I certainly don't censor anybody. I make arguments, but you can dismiss those arguments. I'm not stopping anyone from doing what they want to do. If you want to support some political party you think has some kind of chance of defeating the European Union or changing we're going to reform the European Union from the inside. If you believe that's possible, I'm not physically stopping you. I'm not censoring your ideas. I would argue against that as foolish, but it's not necessarily going to wreck your plan. I mean, if someone thinks that I'm the decision maker here and that if I speak out against your plan, then I'm just going to sabotage it and destroy it. It's not really how this works. But I would argue for tolerance. I would say, look, if you're going to do that, then at least have some tolerance and understanding for people such as myself who are starting to understand that the populist route, the nationalist route, the political route of trying to reform the system directly through majoritarian elections, through democracy, that's a dead end. It hasn't been a possibility for a very long time. Even you can look at things like World War I, World War II, and you can look at the conditions there, the American factor, the American industrial might, and you can look at things with a soft determinism and say, like, look, people thought they had a chance to win that war, but you really didn't. It was really sort of a foregone conclusion. There's no perfect strategy. There's no no insight that someone missed, but you had one side with huge industrial capacity, huge intellectual capacity, huge cryptographic capacity, huge espionage capacity, facing off against a bunch of people who talked about honor and glory and valor and pride, and they thought that if they just had the will to power, then they could win the war. You have those two sides against each other, and I can tell you which one is more likely to succeed. But, at the end of the day, whether I'm right or wrong about that, I think this is an interesting avenue to explore. I think it's an interesting perspective where you look at history and you say that, there seems to be a theme within the microcosm of our times that extends outward into many, many, many macrocosms of history, which is this theme of abstraction, universalism, cosmopolitanism, that we're global citizens, we're citizens of the universe, and what happens in far-flung places is just as important as what happens down the street. And right-wing people will denounce that because that's not the Paleolithic mindset, that's not the warrior mindset, that's not the familiar mindset. But ultimately, I think that that mindset holds us back. That mindset, as painful as it is to break through, we have to confront that pain. We have to confront that suffering. That is our challenge. That is the challenge that we have to overcome, and we have to succeed in spite of that challenge. And in fact, life is all about confronting new challenges and overcoming them in new ways. If we were just doing the same thing over and over again, wouldn't that be sort of boring? Wouldn't that be sort of monotonous? So perhaps this is the challenge of our times, that we have to learn how to move from being in a nationalist mode, an ethno-nationalist mode, a mode in which we put our hopes in political parties and populist think tanks or whatever, and we have to move from that to saying, okay, well, how do minorities survive within a system that actively discriminates against them, that actively hates them? I mean, you had laws that said Jews couldn't do this and couldn't do that, and Jews succeeded in spite of those laws. So how could Europeans survive in spite of explicit discrimination, from affirmative action, from diversity quotas, from anti-white policies around the world? How could they succeed? And my opinion is that you succeed by being a transnational force, that you don't tie yourself to any one country, but you tie yourself not to a physical Jerusalem or a physical, London or a physical capital, but you tie yourself to an abstract capital, to a capital of the heavens, to a spiritual capital. And that is your home. That is your homeland. That's where you reside. And again, that's a lot of what Christianity does, is it says we're not physically Jewish, but we're spiritually part of the seed of Abraham. And we don't physically live in Jerusalem, but Jerusalem is the spiritual Zion, is our home as Christians. So that concept to me is very powerful. And I think world history shows that this idea, this sort of Hegelianism, the supremacy of the idea over the physical conditions, I think this is a powerful concept that, again, I'm not going to stop people from doing what they're already doing. That's not within my power. But I would make the argument that there is an alternative, and that if you want to be successful as a people, you have to explore different strategies. You have to be willing to, juggle more than one ball at once. You have to be willing to allow for different people to do their own thing. And if some people just have to do the ethno-nationalist thing, well, I can't stop them. But I would implore those people to be tolerant and to be open to the people who want to be transnationalist in the same way that you have, Zionist Israelis, and then you have other Jews, and they don't. The way it seems to me is that you have, and I mean, again, you have arguments among Jews, but the opposition, it doesn't seem to be so fierce. It doesn't seem to be so virulent and hateful. The way that European ethno-nationalists look at the betrayal of ethno-nationalism as like like you're a traitor, and so you're the worst thing ever, and you're worse than the traitor is worse than an enemy. That idea that if you are not working within that ethno-nationalist framework, that somehow you're then a traitor and that you're worse than the enemy, that I think can be a destructive idea if you're wrong. Now, if you're right, then sure, go ahead, go full bore, be extremist with your position. But if you are wrong, then you might regret not being a little more tolerant. You might regret not allowing for a freedom and a free flow of ideas, and for people to explore different avenues and different ideas, being so monomaniacal and again putting all your eggs in one basket and saying that this is the only way we can win and we have to do it this way, and anyone who disagrees is a traitor. Well, that's going to limit your intellectual creativity. That's going to limit your ability to attract people who think outside the box. And the unfortunate thing here is that you have a mythological cultural conditioning that tells you if you don't follow along with an anti-white party line, then you're a freak. And so what happens is that the only people who are attracted to pro-white movements are going to be freakish people. And if you say that, well, we're going to have a bunch of freakish people and you have to be an ethno-nationalist, and if you're not, we're going to bully you and we're going to call you a traitor and do all these things, then you actually make your little freak group that's already pretty freakish into even more freakish and hateful and virulent group, and you actually push away a lot of people who would be happy to help you, to be happy to be allies, or to happy to be fellow travelers, or whatever the phraseology you would want to use. They would be happy to push the cultural or mythological Overton window in your direction, but you've rejected them and you've alienated them, and that's what a lot of these people seem to do. And I don't know. It depends on how strict you want to be with your principles versus your pragmatism. When I see people denouncing Jordan Peterson has been censored in New Zealand. His book has been taken off the shelves by a major bookseller. And you can look at that and say, well, that's his just desserts. He gets what he deserves because he censored Faith Goldie. I mean, you can take that position, or you can take the position of something like, this is just what's going to continue to happen. Tucker Carlson is next. Donald Trump is going to be next. They're coming for everybody, and there's no brakes on this train, and that's why we have to understand that whether we all agree with each other or not, that's not the important thing. The important thing is not that we all agree and we come to some common consensus on what we should do or what we shouldn't do. But the really important thing is that we understand that there's no amount of concession that is going to solve the problem. The concept of the Dane Geld, that when the Dane comes and he says, well, I won't invade your country if you give me 1,000 gelders, or whatever the currency is. You give him that money, and then he's going to come back next week and ask for more money. And he's never going to stop. And so every concession that you make to terrorism and to hatred, it's never going to be enough. They're always going to move and shift the Overton window one step over and take one more victim until eventually there's no hope. They totally win, they totally exterminate you, and you're done with. So I'm saying that that process, eventually you have to recognize it for what it is, and you do have to take some sort of free speech absolutist stance where you say, look, we might not agree, we don't have to like each other, but we do have to understand we're in a cultural position here where the center of society, the center of our mythology, is so destructive that we can't come to a compromise with it. We can't say, well, maybe if we just tone down our rhetoric, or maybe we do this or that, then we can. And of course, that's not giving people permission to be hateful in their rhetoric. Again, the argument that, well, they're just going to accuse Jordan Peterson of being a Nazi, so I guess we should just put on our jack boots and put on our brown shirts and march in the streets. That's not a very good argument. That's not a very convincing argument. The argument is something more like, look, if they're going to keep pushing in this direction, and nothing seems to appease them, nothing seems to stop them, there is no level at which you can hold on. You can offer your respectability as a I'm a Buckleyite conservative. I'm respectable because I got on the censorship train and I helped you censor the real bad people, and I'm a good gatekeeper. Well, I think even Chelsea Clinton was accosted by some people, some very radical people, who said something like, Chelsea Clinton is responsible for the Christchurch shooting because her family in some way or another made some sort of Islamophobic comment. Maybe it was the fact that Hillary said Merkel was responsible for the rise of the right wing in Europe. I don't know why they were targeting Chelsea Clinton, but they were targeting Chelsea Clinton. So this mode, this French revolutionary mode, where terror gives way to terror and violence gives way to violence and hatred gives way to hatred, there really is no end to that until you can have some reformulation. And I think that in the case of the French Revolution, it was kind of a Napoleonic reformulation where Napoleon said, look, we're not going to go back to the ancient regime. we're not going to go back to a time where the common people are ignored. We're going to have a new type of France, but it's sort of a synthesis. It's not going to be the eternal French terror, because that's untenable. And it's also not going to just be a return to the past, but there's got to be some synthesis. And the same thing happened in the Soviet Union, where at first there was a Soviet terror, there was a Red Terror, and there were purges, but eventually Stalin said, look, we're going to need to make amends with the church. We can't just keep endlessly persecuting the church, because we need to return to some sort of synthesis where, okay, well, we're not going to totally abandon Marxism, but we can't continue to come down on the church, because we need to arrive at a holistic structure for our society, and that the church is going to have some role to play in that. We can't simply exterminate the church. So Stalin and people like him in the Soviet Union came to this sort of synthesis where they weren't just going to go back to pre-Marxist period, but they said we have to take Marxism and somehow synthesize it with Russian nationalism, with Russian imperialism, with the Orthodox Church. We have to create some kind of synthesis there. We have to return to some form of stability. And that's what Stalin did, and that's what Napoleon did. And they in some ways, their reformulation was short-lived. But they did stop that process of revolution. They did bring a halt to that. And they did give some relative stability to those countries. Is something like that going to happen? Is Terry Baudet, is he going to be the one? Are these nationalist populists in Europe, are they going to be the ones to say, look, we can't simply go back to a time when Europe was colonizing the world, or Europe was dominant over the world, but we also can't continue with this mass immigration, so we have to sort of synthesize the two scenarios to say, like, we're no longer going to be colonial powers, but we are going to have some degree of national populism. It sounds plausible. It sounds conceivable. And I would hope I would be wrong about it being a big circus. I would hope I would be wrong about it being a big facade. And I would hope I would be wrong that it's been tried and tried before many, many times, and it seems to always fail. If that was the case, if I was wrong, then I guess we could all pack our bags and go home and live happily ever after, right? But I'm not so sure. And because I'm not 100% sure, just because I've seen it fail so many times before, if I'm not 100% sure that we should put all our eggs in this basket and keep pushing politically, only to see our political, Brexit and Trump's wall and all, Marine Le Pen, all of these things, we puff them up and we say, oh, this is possible, this is doable, this is something that can happen. And then it always seems to deflate into a miserable spiral of, pathetic failure. So tying yourself to that 100% seems to be a really good way to drive yourself to suicide. So I would say, not to try to sabotage these people, but is there another way? Is there a way out of this situation? Is there a way to look at the world and the situation that we have and not tie ourselves to, we just got to hope and pray and vote for the nationalist populist parties and hope that they're not liars and hope they don't betray us and hope they don't get assassinated, hope they don't get, Sweden Democrats gets the largest percentage of the vote, gets a plurality, and they're shut out by the other parties. AfD is shut out by the other parties. So, they voted for Macron instead of Marine Le Pen, and now we have a French Revolution on our hands and with the yellow vests. So it's happening time and time again. People get so hopeful, and I've just watched the dreams be crushed and systematically in a way that to me it's almost boring at this point. It's monotonous, the way that that you have a rise to power, excitement behind the movement, and then it just deflates into nothingness and nothing was achieved. That continual build-up of pressure, release of pressure back to normalcy, that process to me doesn't seem to be all that productive. Now, again, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that is the only way to do it. But yeah, I would say, is there another way? And to me, that is the concept of looking back at these minoritarian groups and saying, what do they do when their homeland is destroyed? What do they do when they're run out of their homeland? How do they survive? They no longer think of their homeland as a physical place, but they think of it as a metaphysical place, as an abstraction, as a telos. So it's not that we want to get back to the European ethno-state as a physical place, but that we want to abstract the essence of what it means to be European or to be Faustian, and we want to abstract that and view it as a spiritual abstract telos that is without physical locus. It is without a specific homeland, but it is global in its nature, and it can be accessed anywhere at any time. And it's not that we're kin because we come from the same country and we speak the same language, but we are kin because we have the same spiritual homeland, the same metaphysical homeland. That's, of course, how Christians think of themselves. They think of themselves as, we are not citizens. And I'm not speaking about the average Christian, but I'm thinking about dedicated ideological Christians actually do have a globalist conception to themselves that goes back to the earliest Christians, that they were not dedicated to containing Christianity for the Middle East, but they wanted to spread it into Europe, they wanted to spread it into Africa, they wanted to spread it everywhere. They wanted to spread it into India, and so on and so forth. So there's a globalist idea in Christianity that wants to spread itself anywhere and says, we are not citizens of any particular country. We don't have any mother tongue. Our mother tongue is, Christ. Christ is the Logos. Christ is the Holy Spirit is our language. Our homeland is the spiritual Zion. It's the heavenly kingdom, the kingdom of God. That's our true citizenship, not America, not the Middle East, not any particular country. And I think there's something powerful to that when you delocalize yourself, when you universalize yourself, when you abstract yourself. I see that as very historically powerful, and especially now that we have the internet. It seems to me that that is the way that technology is moving. It's moving to amplify the voices of those who are willing to be global. If you're not tying yourself to any particular country and you're saying, no, I am tying myself to an idea, well, you become much more anti-fragile. Because if you're tying yourself to a particular country, then the success or failure of that country determines your success or failure. But if you tie yourself to an idea, then you're no longer working in the absolutes of, did you win the presidential election? Did you get to build the wall? You're no longer dealing with those concrete absolutes, but you're dealing with spiritual abstractions that have infinite degrees of success or failure. And it's much easier from my perspective to be a constructivist when you're dealing with abstractions and ideals. It's much easier to build upon each other in a conversation, in a dialogue, in Talmudism or Pilpul. It's much easier to do that than to try to build a wall. Well, we could build a wall, but it doesn't matter if there's a door or people can just hop in an airplane and fly over it, or the people who are already here have a higher fertility than the population that you're a part of. So, yeah, the emphasis on the wall, the physical wall as a locus, as a concrete, tangible manifestation of power seems to be very, very flaccid. It seems to be, like the man who has a psychological problem. He has low self-confidence, so he buys the fancy car. That to me seems to be a huge waste of time and money and effort, instead of investing yourself in, a big, powerful, masculine wall. And this is how sometimes Democrats will criticize gun owners. Oh, you need that big gun because you're scared and you're not man enough and you have to compensate for something. Your small reproductive organs. If that is a critique that's made, of course we can recognize when that's probably overblown or false. But I think there are cases in which we do obsess about tangible objects that really have no practical effect, rather than focusing on the world of ideas, where ideas actually really are much more powerful because ideas precede the tangible object. It is the idea which gives birth to the tangible object rather than the other way around. It's DNA that gives birth to the human organism, not the other way around. It's the laws of physics that precede matter itself, not the other way around. So if we're looking at this as a cycle, we have to have the idea first. We have to have that. And it's a long enough video. I'm going to stop here. See you next time. Bye-bye.